The river at dusk is not a quiet place. It gurgles, it hisses against stone. It carries the soft complaint of water against root and branch. But on that evening, the sound that cut through the lonely rancher's ears was neither river nor wind. It was sharper, thinner, a cry. Not the cry of a bird, not the cry of coyote or calf. Something else, something unmistakably human. He stopped where the dirt met the riverbank, boot heels sinking into damp earth. For years he had walked these plains with no company but cattle and memory. The land had taught him to trust silence, to respect what breaks it. And this cry was different. It came like a wound, made audible. He followed it, past the bent willow leaning low over the stream, past the cattails that shook in the wind. And then he saw her, a woman half collapsed against the rocks, clothes soaked through, hair tangled with reeds, skin pale as candle wax. Her lips trembled, and when she found breath enough to speak, it came in a whisper, raw with salt and fear. "Save my children first." It was not a plea for herself. It was not the kind of begging that comes when one feels the edge of death. It was something older, something primal, a command born of desperation and love in equal measure. Save the children first. The rancher stood frozen. For a long second, the world seemed to suspend itself. The river stopped rushing, the dusk stopped deepening, even his own lungs refused to draw in air. All that existed was that whisper and the weight it carried. Because here was a truth as old as humanity. When stripped of everything else, of property, of reputation, of safety, what remains is this instinct to place innocence before the self, to carry forward what is fragile even when strength fails. It is both the most human and the most tragic reflex. And yet, with that truth comes a shadow. For every whisper of sacrifice, there is the indifferent silence of reality. Nature does not bend its laws to pity a mother's cry. The river does not pause its current because children are in danger. The land gives and the land takes, without apology, without ceremony. So why does it move us so deeply? Why do we hear those words, "Save my children first," and feel them lodge inside us like an echo we've known forever? Perhaps because we recognize ourselves in it. Each of us carries an unspoken awareness of fragility, that life is built upon a delicate thread, that survival is never guaranteed. When someone cries out for another, not themselves, it slices through the illusions we build. It forces us to confront a brutal duality, that love is both our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. The rancher did not yet know who she was. He did not know if children truly lay hidden somewhere along this riverbank, or if her words belonged to a fevered delirium. But it did not matter. The whisper itself had already changed him. Because such words are not just a call to action, they are a mirror. They ask, what would you do faced with the choice? Would you run? Would you turn away? Or would you step into the current of another's despair, knowing it might drown you too? This was not merely a scene on a lonely evening. It was a question that history has asked again and again. In wars, in famines, in revolutions, in every moment where human beings were forced to choose between the self and the future. The widow by the river was only one voice in a chorus of centuries. But in her trembling breath, the rancher, and we who follow his steps, are invited into that chorus. The cry by the river was not just sound, it was symbol, a symbol of sacrifice, of love sharpened against despair, of humanity struggling against the indifference of a vast and unyielding world. And the question lingers, why do such cries echo across this time, across cultures, across generations? What is it in us that hears them and feels compelled to answer? The rancher, standing there, boots damp in the mud, had no answer. Not yet. Only the sound of the river and the memory of that whisper, "Save my children first." The cry by the river does not belong to one woman, nor to one time. It is older than language itself. Across cultures, across centuries, the image repeats, the desperate voice rising against indifference, carrying the same message: protect the innocent, preserve what comes after. In Scripture, the story is told of a Hebrew mother who placed her infant in a basket, setting him afloat upon the Nile. She could not fight Pharaoh's soldiers. She could not stop the decree that condemned her son. But she could cry out in silence, trusting the river to carry what her arms could no longer shield. That infant, drawn from the reeds, became Moses, a savior who would lead his people out of bondage. Out of a mother's desperation was born a myth that still shapes civilizations. In Greek tragedy too, the archetype resounds. Think of Andromache, wife of Hector, begging for the life of her child as Troy burned, or Niobe, turned to stone, still weeping for children slain by the gods. These stories are not historical accounts. They are mirrors of something deeper, that in moments of collapse, the cry for children is the last, most unyielding plea. Even in the wastelands of modern war, the pattern endures. In photographs smuggled out of bombed cities, we see mothers with mouths open in voiceless screams, their arms shielding bodies smaller than their own. The setting changes. Ancient reeds, burning citadels, ruined hospitals, but the cry is the same. It echoes because it belongs not to the individual, but to the archetype. Carl Jung once wrote of the collective unconscious, a reservoir of symbols and instincts inherited across generations. Within it, live archetypes: the mother, the protector, the savior. They appear in dreams, in myths, in the choices we make without knowing why. And when the widow by the river whispered, "Save my children first," she was not speaking only for herself. She was channeling the archetype, that eternal figure of the mother, whose voice calls out from the depths of human memory. We recognize it because it is already within us. The cry vibrates against something encoded in our blood. Even those without children feel its pull, because survival itself has always depended on such instincts. Long before there were nations or laws, tribes endured only when the weakest were protected. To ignore the cry was to invite extinction. To answer it was to allow the thread of life to continue. But here lies the paradox. The archetype is not gentle. It is fierce, demanding, unrelenting. A mother's love, when threatened, becomes something almost divine in its power, but also terrifying in its intensity. This is why the cry unsettles us. It exposes a raw truth that civilization often hides, that beneath our philosophies and our systems, the primal imperative remains: protect the future at any cost. Yet history shows how this instinct can be manipulated. Leaders, propagandists, rulers, they have long understood that to summon the archetype of the child in danger is to stir a force deeper than reason. Think of the speeches that call upon saving the children to justify wars. Think of governments that weaponize innocence to mask ambition. The archetype can be genuine, but it can also be exploited. It is a mirror, but also a tool. And so the widow's whisper becomes more than a single act of desperation. It becomes a symbol of the tension between purity and power. On one side, the authentic human instinct to protect the vulnerable. On the other, the machinery of society that knows how to turn that instinct into fuel for its own ends. When we hear the cry, we are moved. But when the powerful hear it, they calculate. This duality explains why such cries are universally haunting. They remind us of our shared humanity, yet also of our shared susceptibility. The rancher at the riverbank heard only a whisper, but behind it stood millennia of myth and memory. It was as if she spoke with the voices of every mother who had ever begged the world to spare the young. And perhaps this is why such scenes lodge so deeply in us, because they ask us not only to feel, but to choose, to decide whether we will let the archetype guide us toward compassion or allow it to be twisted into obedience. The collective unconscious carries the symbols, but what we make of them is always the question. The widow's words linger not because they are hers, but because they are ours. They belong to the hidden language that has bound humanity together since the first child was shielded from storm or predator. They are part of the script we are born reciting, even if we never speak it aloud. And so, standing with the rancher by the river, we sense something larger than one moment. We sense the pulse of myth, the weight of history, the shadow of psychology. The cry by the river is an archetype, timeless, universal, endlessly repeating. And it waits for us, even now, in the next crisis, the next war, the next silence, broken by a voice pleading the same eternal words: save the children first. Sacrifice has always been one of the strangest features of human life. It seems illogical at first glance. Why would a living being surrender comfort, wealth, or even life itself for another? Yet from the smallest family decisions to the grand arcs of history, sacrifice is everywhere. It is the quiet engine that drives our survival, our morality, and even our myths. Biologists remind us that nature is unsentimental. The survival of the species is not guaranteed by strength alone, but by the instinct to protect the vulnerable. Among animals, we see this reflex emerge in flashes, birds feigning broken wings to lure predators away from their nests, elephants forming defensive circles around calves. But nowhere is the instinct sharper, more extreme than in humans. Our entire evolutionary story rests on this paradox. We are fragile individually, yet powerful collectively. And the glue of that collective is sacrifice. To raise a child is, in essence, to delay gratification for decades. Food, shelter, protection, energy, all diverted from the self toward the offspring. Evolutionary psychology suggests this is not altruism in the abstract, but a strategy etched into our blood. Without it, the line ends. Protecting the child is protecting the future self, extended beyond the body, into generations yet unborn. And yet, psychology complicates this picture. Studies on empathy show that humans often extend sacrificial instincts beyond their own bloodline. A soldier throws himself on a grenade to shield his comrades. A stranger dives into a river to save someone else's child. These acts defy the logic of individual survival. They speak to something deeper than genes, a sense that the continuation of life, of innocence, of the group, matters more than the self in moments of crisis. But sacrifice is not always noble. It is haunted by its own shadow. For every parent who rushes into fire for a child, there are darker records in history. Sieges where the starving sold their children for bread. Camps where desperation turned protection into betrayal. Civilization itself is marked by moments when leaders, instead of preserving the future, gambled it away for power. Think of dictators who emptied their nation's treasuries, sacrificing education, food, and children's futures for monuments and wars. The instinct to protect the next generation exists, but so too does the instinct to preserve the self at their expense. This is the paradox at the heart of sacrifice. We are creatures pulled in two directions, towards self-preservation and towards self-offering. Sometimes those currents align, sometimes they clash, and in the clash, we glimpse the unsettling truth that humanity's survival has always depended on our willingness to lose. The widow by the river embodies this tension. Her words, "Save my children first," remind us of the ideal, the instinct, the archetype. But they also provoke the unsettling question, will that instinct always prevail? History suggests otherwise. It is not only individuals who face this test. Entire societies whisper the same plea. Every civilization, in its own way, asks to be remembered, to have its children spared from ruin. Yet not all are saved. Consider Rome in its decline. Bread was scarce, but spectacles continued. Generations were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of glory. Or think of modern powers that speak of protecting their people while selling the future through poisoned air, endless debt, or wars fought in children's names. The cry, "Save the children first," often meets the silence of ambition. Psychologists argue that sacrifice shapes not only survival, but identity. To give something up, time, safety, life, is to tell a story about who we are and what we value. Parents working multiple jobs to secure education are in effect scripting a narrative that the child matters more than comfort. Likewise, soldiers who march, knowing they may not return, are telling the story that the group is worth more than the self. But when sacrifice fails, when leaders choose themselves, when societies abandon their future, another story is written, a darker one. It is the story of civilizations that collapse not because of enemies without, but because of betrayals within. The widow's whisper, then, is more than a cry for her children. It is civilization itself speaking. Every society has its moment by the river, soaked and trembling, begging the world to preserve its next generation. And every time, the test is the same. Will the strong answer that cry, or will they turn away, lost in the flood of their own fears and ambitions? Sacrifice reveals the truth of a people. It exposes what we love, what we fear, what we choose to preserve, when preservation costs us everything. That is why it haunts us so deeply. Because in the end, we know that survival is never just about the present moment. It is always about the willingness to give now so that someone else can live later. And so the rancher's encounter becomes not only a story of one woman's plea, but a mirror for all of us. When the future cries out, what will we surrender? What will we give up to ensure it endures? Or will we, like so many before us, choose ourselves and let the river carry away what could have been? The psychology of sacrifice is not abstract. It is lived in every choice, every trade, every silence or answer to the voice that says, across all generations, save the children first. History is full of rivers. Some are carved in geography, others in memory, and along their banks, again and again, the same cry rises, save the children first. In the Second World War, mothers stood at train stations clutching the hands of children they would never see again. The Kindertransport carried Jewish children away from Nazi territories, a desperate gamble at survival. Many of those mothers were left behind, waving as the train pulled away, knowing they themselves would not escape. The whistle of steam engines became a kind of river song, carrying the fragile cargo of innocence across borders while the parents remained to face what came. It was not just an act of love, it was a conscious surrender. They placed the future on the train, while they stayed in the fire. This was not new. In every war, every famine, every great unraveling, the children are both the most shielded and the most endangered. During the Irish famine, families crossed rivers swollen with rain, carrying the smallest on their shoulders, while others slipped beneath the current. In America's Dust Bowl, migrants packed wagons with children curled against sacks of flour, hoping to outpace starvation. And in more recent decades, the images from Syria, from Sudan, from Ukraine, rivers crossed not only of water, but of borders, culture, and identity. In every case, the cry repeats, whispered or screamed, let the young survive, even if the old do not. Yet history also shows the darker side of this cry. Leaders have long recognized its power, and they have harnessed it for ends far from innocent. In Rome, politicians paraded children through the Forum, warning citizens that enemies threatened their sons and daughters. The message was not merely protection, it was obedience. Fight for the children, they said, even as those children were later conscripted for the very wars their parents had resisted. Centuries later, the same tactic endured. During the First World War, British propaganda posters showed women and children fleeing burning villages, urging men to enlist. In the Second, images of children under bombardment became rallying cries for sacrifice, rationing, and bloodshed. The innocence of youth, displayed in wide eyes and trembling hands, became a weapon sharper than any blade. To protect the child, people would march into slaughter. Modern campaigns are no different. Humanitarian organizations, often sincere, still rely on the same archetype. Photographs of malnourished children, of wide-eyed orphans, of small figures against barbed wire fences. These images cut deeper than statistics ever could. They compel empathy, action, donations, and yet they also reveal the enduring truth. The child's cry is a universal trigger. It bypasses reason. It demands response, which is why it can be both genuine and exploited. But behind the manipulation lies something deeper. The cry survives precisely because it is true. At the edge of every civilization, we find it. When rivers of migration swell, Armenians forced into deserts, Jews crossing borders, Vietnamese climbing into boats, Central Americans crossing into the unknown, the children are always at the center. The photographs, the stories, the songs pass down all orbit around them. A father carrying his daughter through the Mekong. A mother pushing a child beneath a barbed fence. A widow trembling by a river, whispering the words that have echoed for thousands of years, "Save the children first." There is something haunting about rivers themselves. They mark thresholds, transitions, the passage from one life to another. In myth, they separate the living from the dead. In history, they separate the safe from the doomed. And always, on their banks, humanity faces its test. Who will be carried across, and who will be left behind? The record is mixed. There are moments of staggering generosity, parents placing their last food into the mouths of children, strangers carrying infants, not their own, through blizzards and battlefields. But there are also moments of betrayal. Societies that promise to save their young, only to spend their futures in the currency of war, debt, and pollution. Leaders who cry for the children while sacrificing those very children to ambition. The river does not care which side is chosen. It flows on, impartial. The choice belongs to us. And so history's rivers remind us of something uncomfortable. The cry to save children is timeless, but the response is not guaranteed. Sometimes it leads to acts of transcendent humanity. Sometimes it becomes a mask for cruelty. What makes it powerful is not only the instinct behind it, but the way it forces a decision. That is why these images lodge so deeply in the collective memory. The mother at the train station, the father at the border, the widow at the riverbank. They are all variations of the same eternal scene. A threshold, a choice, a plea for the future at the expense of the present. Leaders know this. Religions know it. Empires have always known it. Save the children is the one command that can summon armies, silence dissent, open purses, and justify wars. It is both the most sincere and the most dangerous cry in human history, because it speaks directly to our survival, and because it can be twisted into almost anything. Still, despite the manipulation, despite the betrayals, despite the failures of history, the cry endures. It has never disappeared. It cannot disappear because it comes from the deepest strata of what it means to be human. It is the voice of every generation begging not to be the last. And that is why, when the lonely rancher heard it by the river, it struck him silent. He was not just hearing one widow in one moment. He was hearing history. He was hearing the cries of mothers in burning cities, of fathers on collapsing borders, of strangers crossing rivers of dust and fire. He was hearing the eternal demand that civilization has never stopped making of itself: save the children first. The widow by the river is not gone. She is here, standing in our age. Though her face has changed, she is no longer soaked in reeds and trembling in the dusk. She speaks now in headlines, in warnings, in silences we pretend not to hear. Her whisper remains the same: save my children first. But in the 21st century, the question sharpens. Who are the children she means? Look around, and you can hear her voice in the ecological crisis. Rising seas, burning forests, collapsing species, all of them are rivers swelling at our borders. The cry to save the children is no longer metaphor. Future generations stand on the bank, watching as we gamble away their inheritance for convenience and profit. The atmosphere thickens, the oceans warm, and the widow whispers through the smoke, "Do not sacrifice them for your short-term hunger." But too often, the whisper goes unheard, drowned out by the clamor of markets, elections, and distractions. She speaks, too, in the silence of broken families, fractured communities, and vanishing traditions. The modern world moves fast, faster than roots can hold. In cities of glass and steel, many grow up without anchors, raised by screens more than by hands. The widow's whisper is there as well. Protect what binds us together. Save the stories, the bonds, the fragile trust that allows children to grow into more than consumers. Yet her plea is met with noise. The endless churn of entertainment, the distraction of algorithms, the shallow substitutes for meaning. And then there is politics. Here, the widow's cry is twisted most dangerously. Governments and movements across the globe invoke the phrase for the children as a weapon. Wars are justified in their name. Censorships are defended under the guise of protecting youth. Surveillance is expanded to guard future generations. The widow's authentic whisper becomes amplified, distorted, turned into a rallying cry for policies that, ironically, often leave children more endangered. To save the children, we are told, we must obey. And so, the cry that should unite us is instead divided, manipulated, repurposed. But what if the children are not only literal? Perhaps the widow in our century speaks also of symbolic children, the fragile future itself, innocence, the uncorrupted part of humanity that still remembers how to wonder, how to hope. In this light, Save the Children becomes a plea to protect not just bodies, but souls, to shield the fragile possibility of a human being who can still look at the world with awe, with moral clarity, with tenderness not yet eroded by cynicism. The danger is not only that we failed to answer her, it is that we forget how to hear her at all. In a world so saturated with noise, the whisper of the widow risks being drowned. We scroll past it, numb to images of suffering. We change the channel when it asks too much of us. We reframe it as someone else's problem. In this silence, another sacrifice occurs, the quiet surrender of empathy itself. And without empathy, the cry cannot survive. To face the widow today is to face ourselves, to admit that we are the generation standing on the riverbank with the choice. Do we consume, exploit, and gamble, leaving the future to drown? Or do we carry something across, even if it costs us? The answer is not found in speeches or slogans, but in the small, stubborn acts of sacrifice we choose in daily life. To consume less, to care more, to resist manipulation, to guard the fragile sparks of innocence where we find them. The cry of "Save the Children first" is no longer just the mother's whisper in a single moment of despair. It is the collective voice of the age, asking whether humanity can look beyond its own reflection. And if we fail, if we do not answer, then the children left to inherit our silence will not only inherit our world, they will inherit our failure. That is the weight of the modern widow. She does not scream. She whispers, because deep down, we already know the truth. The choice is before us. The children, both literal and symbolic, wait at the edge of the river. And the question remains as haunting as it has ever been. Will we save them first? Or will we let the current take them as it has taken so much before? The cries by the river do not stop. The widow's whisper cuts through the night air, trembling with urgency. Save my children first. And the rancher, alone, exhausted, holding his own fears close, must decide. He cannot save everyone. He cannot silence the river's roar. The dilemma is unbearable in its simplicity. Whose life, whose suffering, whose future will weigh most heavily on his hands? Here, the story shifts from the widow to the man who found her. The focus turns not on the helpless, but on the one who hears. Because to hear a cry is already to be implicated. To walk past it would be easier, to pretend the sound belongs to something else, to bury it under the noise of chores, survival, and necessity. But the rancher has heard it, and now silence is no longer innocence. Philosophers have wrestled with this burden. Dostoevsky once wrote that each of us is responsible for all, before all, and for everything. A radical claim, that no human is an island, and that the suffering of others presses upon us as if it were our own. To live with such awareness is to feel the widow's whisper as a constant presence, reminding us that the cries of others can never be fully separated from our own fate. And yet, Hannah Arendt complicates this with her reflections on moral choice. In times of great pressure, she argued, individuals often face impossible dilemmas, where every decision, including inaction, carries moral weight. For Arendt, responsibility is not measured by perfect solutions, but by the courage to choose even when no choice is clean. The rancher, standing at the river, embodies this tension. He cannot save both the widow and the children. He cannot erase the flood, and he cannot undo the cruelty of fate. But still, he must choose. This is where the metaphor sharpens into our own reflection. Each of us, in our daily lives, plays the role of the rancher. We wake to news of crises, wars, hunger, climate catastrophe, human suffering at scales too large to comprehend. Like the rancher, we are not omnipotent. We cannot save everyone. The temptation, then, is to do nothing, to look away, to surrender to paralysis in the face of immensity. But here lies the dangerous illusion, that doing nothing absolves us. It does not. Silence is also a choice. Turning away is also a form of responsibility, for it leaves the cries unanswered, the river unchallenged. The rancher who refuses to act has still acted. He has chosen himself over the voice of the widow. The question grows sharper. How much responsibility does one lonely figure carry for the collective suffering of the world? To some, the answer may seem cruelly small. An individual cannot heal the brokenness of humanity. And yet history reminds us that many turning points have hinged on the smallest acts of conscience. A single hand extended, a single refusal to obey cruelty, a single whisper against silence. Perhaps the measure of responsibility is not in the scale of what we solve, but in the courage to refuse indifference. In this sense, the rancher symbolizes more than one man in a story. He is each of us, faced with the moral weight of hearing cries we did not expect. He asks the same questions we ask ourselves. Do I save myself? Do I protect my own first? Do I dare to risk something for those I do not know? Do I walk away and pretend I heard nothing? The widow's whisper lingers because it refuses easy answers. It cuts into the modern illusion that we can live untouched by the cries of others. The river, after all, flows through us all. To deny it is to live in a fragile dream that someday, somehow, we will not be the ones on its edge, crying out for someone else to hear. So the dilemma of the rancher becomes our dilemma. Responsibility is never comfortable. It never fits neatly into the boxes of politics or ideology. It demands that we confront ourselves, not in the abstract, but in the small, unrelenting moments of choice. Do we respond, or do we let silence decide for us? The rancher stands still by the river, caught between despair and duty. The cries echo into the night. And though his hands are empty, though his strength is small, the truth is unavoidable. To hear the widow is already to be called. To ignore her is to betray more than her children. It is to betray the possibility of what it means to be human. The decision remains. It always remains, and it is never someone else's. The river does not end. It moves with a force older than the rancher, older than the widow, older than their cries. To stand beside it is to stand before time itself, a current that has carried every civilization, every dream, and every failure. Civilizations have always gathered around rivers. The Nile carved Egypt's destiny in stone, flooding its banks and feeding its soil. The Indus nurtured some of humanity's first cities, while the Tigris and Euphrates birthed Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. Water gives life, but every river also carries a shadow. The same Nile that fed Egypt drowned fields and villages. The same Tigris that gave rise to empires swept them away with merciless floods. Civilization is born not only from stability, but from the risk of catastrophe. The cries by the river, then, are not only the cries of one widow or of her children. They are humanity's cry across history, each voice pleading not to be swallowed by the flood, not to be forgotten by the endless current. To survive the river has always been the human story. And yet, the river is more than geography. It is history itself, the unstoppable current of time. We may build dams, bridges, cities, and monuments along its banks, but the current continues, indifferent to our intentions. Dynasties fall into it, nations vanish beneath its waves. Ideologies, once shouted like thunder, are reduced to whispers carried away. The rancher, standing at its edge, is also standing at the edge of history, faced with a current that will not stop for him, no matter how desperately he wishes it would. What then does it mean when the widow whispers, "Save my children first"? On the surface, it is a plea for survival. But at a deeper level, it is civilization's eternal demand. The future must be preserved, even as the present is threatened by the river's force. The child becomes the fragile vessel into which we pour our hope. Save them, the widow begs, because they are the only way to resist the river's erasure. But this raises a haunting question. What happens when the river itself cannot be tamed? When floods of history, wars, famines, collapses, sweep entire generations away before they even have a chance to stand. In such moments, to save the children first is not just an act of compassion, but an act of defiance. It is a refusal to let the current dictate everything. It is a fragile stand against inevitability. Still, the paradox remains. We cannot stop the river. Civilization has always been both nourished and destroyed by it. Perhaps that is why so many myths imagine rivers as borders between worlds. The Styx, across which souls are ferried. The Jordan, marking entrance into the promised land. The Ganges, cleansing life yet claiming death. To cross the river is to cross into transformation. To live beside it is to live on borrowed time. And here, psychology meets history. For the river is not only outside of us, but within us. It is the stream of memory, the unconscious, the endless flow of thought and desire. Just as civilizations build dams and rituals to contain the river outside, we build myths, beliefs, and identities to manage the one within. But both rivers remain untamed. Floods come. What we suppress returns. What we bury resurfaces. So when the widow cries to save her children, she is also asking, how do we preserve innocence, meaning, and humanity in a world where the current never stops? How do we protect fragile hope in a history that has drowned so many before us? The rancher cannot stop the river. Neither can we. But what he can do, what we can do, is to decide how we will stand against it. To choose whether the flood will strip us of our humanity or deepen it. to decide whether we will save ourselves only or fight to carry the fragile lives of others into the next shore. Civilization itself is nothing more than this struggle. Each generation hears the river and wonders if it will survive its crossing. Some build walls, some build bridges, some abandon hope altogether. But the cry to save the children remains unchanged, a whisper carried from one shore to the next, demanding that the future not be swallowed whole. The river flows on. It always has. It always will. The question is not whether it will drown us, but whether we will leave behind enough strength, enough courage, enough compassion to keep carrying voices across. Whether, in the end, we will be remembered as those who tried to save the children or those who let the current decide for us. The image lingers. The lonely rancher, the rushing river, the widow whispering through trembling lips, "Save my children first." At first, it seemed like a desperate cry belonging only to one night, one woman, one family. But the more we listen, the more we realize this whisper has never belonged to her alone. It is older than the rancher, older than the river, older than the frontier itself. It is the same plea that echoes through every age of civilization. A mother's voice, humanity's conscience, haunting us with the same question. What will we protect when the flood rises? Perhaps the widow is not a character at all. Perhaps she is a mirror, a reflection of what every generation must face. The choice between self-preservation and sacrifice, between walking away and bending down to lift another from the water. History suggests that the whisper never goes away. In times of famine, the whisper was there, asking the strong to share their grain with the weak. In times of war, the whisper was there, begging rulers not to throw their young into endless battles. In times of collapse, the whisper was there, urging us to think not only of survival today, but of what we leave behind for tomorrow. Always, the whisper is the same. Save my children first. But if this voice is our conscience, then we must ask, how often have we failed it? How many times have we turned away, convincing ourselves that the flood was too strong, that we were too weak, that the children were not ours to save? The ruins of empires, the ashes of cities, the scars left behind by war and greed, all of them testify to moments when the whisper was ignored. And yet, humanity endures, which means that somewhere in every collapse, there were those who listened. Someone who decided that the future mattered. Someone who carried the children, even if it meant drowning themselves. Civilization survives not because of kings and conquerors, but because of those unseen acts of sacrifice, quiet hands pulling the vulnerable onto dry lands. The question, then, is not whether the widow's whisper will come again. It will. The river always rises. The flood always returns. The question is whether we will hear it. Whether, in our time, with our technologies, our crises, our fragile societies, we will stop and listen. Today, the cries by the river are not distant. They are everywhere. They are in refugee camps, where mothers clutch children through hunger and exile. They are in burning cities, where families huddle in basements as the world above them collapses. They are in our own streets, in our own neighborhoods, in every place where vulnerability meets indifference. The widow's whisper is no longer a story told in past tense. It is now. It is here. And so the rancher's story becomes our story. When we stand at the riverbank of history, when we hear the fragile voice asking us to save the children first, how will we answer? Will we bend down? Will we act? Will we risk something of ourselves to protect what is most fragile? Or will we walk away, telling ourselves it is not our burden, not our blood, not our fight? The video ends, but the whisper does not. It will follow us after the screen goes dark. It will follow us into the quiet moments when we decide how to live, how to act, how to build, how to love. Because in the end, the true measure of civilization is not its monuments, not its armies, not even its philosophies. It is whether we listened to the widow, whether we answered her call, whether we saved the children, or let the river take them. The whisper haunts us still, and the question remains, when you hear it, will you answer?